issues are compounded in many of these regions simply because they're much larger populations and in some cases fewer resources at their disposal. But I think this is where entrepreneurship becomes really exciting. There is no better place to test our assumptions and to develop the strategic toolkit, increase engagement, build community. And I think we have a very exciting and diverse panel of people who can speak to these issues in a variety of contexts. We will begin with Nicolai Strøm-Olsen from Norway, who has studied a variety of cities and environments in Europe to understand what the building blocks truly are to create a vibrant arts and entrepreneurial culture. And we also have Dr. Tawfik Jelassi, who actually took a break from an academic career to do a very exciting thing of becoming an education minister in Tunisia for a period of just a year with a very wide charter after the Arab Spring. And we also have Efosa Ojomo, who will talk about innovation and its role in development. He's working with the Clayton Christensen Institute and testing some of the theories of disruptive innovation and jobs to be done in this context. And he also has a great blog on the Drucker Forum website, which I hope you'll take a look at. So what I'm going to do process-wise is similar to what we've seen earlier. Each gentleman will have about 10 minutes, and then we will have some dialogue and Q&A from the audience. So without any further delay, Nicolai?
Yeah, thank you. Well, what is it that makes entrepreneurship thrive in certain cities while it doesn't in other? That is the question we started to think about 2 years ago when we started to work with the book Startup Europe. And our idea was, of course, to try to figure out what is the best practice. And in the beginning, we started to ask people, what do you think makes certain places exciting? And what we often heard, for instance, when people were talking about Berlin or Tallinn, was that it was inexpensive to live there. So you could have, for instance, the same standard of living for 2,000 euros a month in Berlin, which you would have to pay 3,500 euros in London, for instance. But the problem with this assumption was that if being cheap was what made you successful, why wasn't then Dresden a hit? Why was Tallinn a hit, but not Vilnius? So what we found when we started to do research was that successful cities in building entrepreneurship, they have a combination of people, knowledge, and money. And we decided to call that the ecosystem. And an ecosystem is basically, universities, accelerators, incubators, startups, venture capital in quite close proximity, co-working spaces. And basically that means that if you are a person with a good idea and you go and you find somewhere to sit and work, you might find peers who you can start to work with. So we tend to call that for institutionalized free-flowing knowledge. And the free-flowing is important because basically it means that in a good ecosystem, everybody gains when someone succeeds. One example of that is in Tallinn, where a couple of years ago, Skype was a big success. And the people building that business brought back to Tallinn knowledge on how to build a global company, how to find venture capital, how to work internationally. And this knowledge has then been used by other startups in Tallinn. And the fact then is that the more successful one of these ecosystems become, the more capital and talent they attract. So what would we define as Europe's big challenges at the moment? Well, first of all, we've been building ecosystem in several European cities. And these ecosystems are in a various degree good at creating tech companies, technology companies. There is still, at the same time, you see that the number of entrepreneurs in Europe is falling. And one of the problems is that if you are wanting to start a business as an unskilled person, or perhaps you're skilled but you're a baker, starting a company today is not very much simpler than it was 20 years ago. It's a little bit easier perhaps, but the change is not that big. So basically what we need to do is that we need to use this, the methodology of building tech companies and try to get this system to work in the entire economy so that even though you're not skilled, you will be able to get help and knowledge on how to, go from being a self-employed, making very little, to perhaps employ one more person and making a little bit more. And the other problem which we have in Europe is actually on the people side. And it's one of the things that I've been surprised of going around to universities in Europe, and I meet professors saying that, all right, now we've built this incubator, we have an innovation program, and our problem is that our students, when they are done with their master degrees, they want to go and work for a big corporation, or they want to work for the government, or they want to become a science. So basically, the result is that the war for talent in startups is much tougher than it would have been if we had managed to unleash the entrepreneurial spirit in our students in Europe. So that's Europe's problem. And I think there is another interesting fact with this ecosystem, and that is that it's visible. And that brings me to what I believe is one of the problems in Northern Africa and the Middle East, if you exclude Israel, and that is you don't have an ecosystem. And as a person who are interested in startups in this area, you end up sitting, where do I go? Where can I, if I want to do business in Northern Africa, who should I contact? And I had this same situation in Bergen, actually, with a investor who was interested in startups, and he said, I went to the Chamber of Commerce, and I asked, what is the most interesting startups in Bergen? Now, there are several. But the person in the reception said, you should go up to the university, and you could ask there. And he said, yeah, okay, cool, where's the university? Yeah, it's up on the top of the hill. And suddenly, you lose the momentum. And so basically my conclusion is that we're going into a new economy where it is possible to build ecosystems. I learned this also in Serbia, which was quite interesting, where I saw that there were sort of two entrepreneurial cultures. One culture was the traditional. They were in agriculture, they were in manufacturing, and when we did several interviews with them, the common thing was that people were complaining about the government. The government was corrupt, they were unreliable, you couldn't trust it, and I'm sure that, some of these complaints are correct. And then we went to Belgrade and we met another ecosystem, being tech startups. And they said, we don't care about the government because we sell our products abroad. We have a server in Germany, we make our money and we take our money as a salary on ATMs. So the government can't really do anything about us, all right? They can tax us, but they will do it anyway, but they really can't hurt us. And that tells me that in this new economy, you can actually, in a country that is not very favorable to entrepreneurship, build an ecosystem by thinking international. Thank you.
since Nicolai was so efficient, Tawfik, you actually gained 2 extra minutes to elaborate even more and tell us your fascinating story.
Thank
Please
you.
go ahead.
Thank you very much.
I might need those two.
Let me start with a small warning. I speak few languages, but all of them with a foreign accent, including my mother tongue, believe it or not. Nicolai talked about Norway, Scandinavia, Europe. I'll talk about mainly North Africa. But I think what I'm going to say applies also to the Middle East. I have here people from academia, from consulting. I will put on for my next 10 minutes my hat as a former minister in the post-revolution government of Tunisia. I heard many bad things about governments. Let me try to defend them a bit. Now that I was part of government and I tried to face a number of challenges. So how did I land there? First of all, after my 30 years as an academic professor, business school dean, USA and Europe. Imagine out of the blue, you receive a phone call from the prime minister that you didn't know before, and that call came after you spending 35 years outside of your home country. You are not a politician nor affiliated with any political party. And the prime minister in that call asked you to become his minister of higher education, research and technology, to pack suitcase and fly from Paris to Tunis and start serving the next day. What would you have done? Would you have accepted this job? Were you brave enough to commit a career suicide? You even speak your home language with a strong foreign accent. People there ask you what country you come from. How can you lead 3 ministries in high political upheaval, social turmoil, insecurity, violence, terrorism, and you are not geared, you are not coached, you are not prepared for it? That's exactly what happened to me in 2013. So just to give you a context. So I accepted this job. My family was against it. I left behind a crying family when I flew to Tunis, and I had 2 challenges: to deliver on the expectations and try to keep my family not that worried, because they were hoping to see me again. We had political assassinations in the country a few months before that. Anyway, when I arrived, I realized that half of the country's jobless people are university graduates, a number of them with a master's or even PhD degrees in science, in technology, etc. So what would you do? We are not an elected government. Some of the people in the country did not see us fully legitimate, and I thought the first task I should undertake is to reform the higher education system, because I felt our universities produce more unemployed people than anything else. Maybe because of a mismatch between the skill set of the graduates and the needs of the job market. Maybe we should push more entrepreneurship, not just education, and as it was stated by Nicolai, people, all what they wanted to do is to become a government civil servant or to become employee by a corporation. But the government cannot hire anymore. If anything, government needed to lay off people. It was overstaffed. The private sector was made 90+% by small and medium-sized enterprises that cannot create hundreds of thousands of new jobs per year. So what is left? If public sector cannot hire and private sector is very constrained in the number of new jobs they can create annually, for me there was no doubt. It is entrepreneurship. And they came up with this reform based on not just education for employment, but rather education for self-employment. That was the banner of my education reform. Education for self-employment. So we may agree on that concept, but how would you walk the talk? How would you operationalize this concept? So first of all, setting up an incubator at every higher education institution. Second, trying to change the curriculum, to change entrepreneurship, modeling, business modeling, programming, management, technology, fundraising, and try to do that as early as possible in the education system. Then having a couple of state banks to provide financing and venture capital and microloans to the entrepreneurs. And then hire the coaches and the mentors and the tutors who can hold these graduates by the hand and show them, if they have an idea, how to turn it into a startup, a project. And most difficult, how to change the mindset of these people to say, you graduated from the university, so you have a competence. Let us give you the confidence and let us help you to become an entrepreneur. Don't wait for an employer to hire you. Maybe that happens, maybe that will not happen. But in the meantime, instead of sitting in cafes, sipping tea all day long, why don't you try something positive, which is good for you, good for your family, good for society, instead of relying on the pocket money that you may get from your parents, living with your family, etc. Where is the dignity if you do a revolution and you don't give these young people a job, an income, a place to live? They lose even face vis-à-vis the rest of society. So this is what I undertook. We were an interim caretaker government. We had only 1 year of mandate. We were a technocrats government. So the politicians didn't want to see us too long in the position. They gave us 1 year. And for me, I framed it like my sabbatical year serving in a post-revolution government. So we were able to draft the reform and to get it officially approved, but the time was too short to roll it out nationwide. And we left it to the government that succeeded us, a political coalition government, to proceed with the implementation of it. But what we tried to do is very much to try to give a ray of hope to these young people who were desperate. And some of them thought, why even bother with higher education? The more you study, the longer you study, the more likely you will end up jobless. So you see again the type of situation that we have faced. And this is, as it was mentioned, not only specific to Tunisia. I would say this is common issues of how to create job opportunities for the youth across many North Africa, Middle Eastern countries. So this is, in a nutshell, within the time given to me, how to try to change the mindset towards a value creator and a job creator type of young graduate, as opposed to waiting for that nice contract to come his or her way. And as I said, it changes the fabric, it helps the economic system, because if you do create a startup as a university graduate, hopefully you need some people to help you with that new venture. You will become yourself an employer and you will create jobs for others. So it's like a virtuous circle that can kick in if you can put it in place and if you are credible with the concept. So that's what I wanted to share with you. Yes, it is not only entrepreneurship for survival, it is entrepreneurship for prosperity, for value creation, and hopefully for economic growth. Thank you.
Next, we will go to Efosa, and you are a lucky man. You were concerned about time, and you picked up some time as well, so we will get started and look forward to his insights about innovation.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much. Before this session began, I told Deepa that if she lets me, I'm just going to keep talking, and I might be talking till tomorrow. So I'm glad I've got a couple more minutes. I might use them. But I'd like to really talk today about the importance of good theory. Now, I know when we hear the word theory, our minds go to different places. But let me just couch or anchor my talk today on what is the importance of using good theory to make decisions. Now, I went to business school in 2013 in Boston, and I had the opportunity to take a class with Professor Clay Christensen. And the class is called Building and Sustaining a Successful Enterprise. Now, in that class, we do the case method at Harvard Business School. We go through a case, and we go through a theory module. And so it's double the reading, but it's the most popular class at the business school. And because what the professors try to do in the course is explain that there is actually cause and effect if we look at the way management makes decisions, right? I mean, a theory is essentially a statement of causality. It's what causes what and why. And so Professor Christensen developed the disruption theory that's been widely used, very popular. several other theories we go through in the course. And I started thinking about the theories we were studying in the course and started thinking about why I went to business school. I went to business school so that we could figure out how to use business as a tool to solve many of the problems in the world today. I'm from Nigeria, and as you know, that part of the world, youth unemployment, poverty, and there's a lack of prosperity. And I started realizing that these theories were actually very applicable to the circumstances that many countries found themselves in that region of the world. Many countries in Asia as well, in Latin America. And I got the opportunity over the last year and a half to work with Professor Christensen, still working with him on how do we take these theories and apply them to innovation in these circumstances so that we can start to create a new narrative on how we can create prosperity. Because if one thing is clear, over the last couple days, there's a lot of uncertainty, there's a lot of complexity, even in these parts of the world that we call developed, much less in other parts of the world that don't yet have the institutions, don't yet have the infrastructures that we enjoy in these parts of the world. And just to illustrate how important this is, imagine you went to your doctor. And so this is one of the illustrations in the book, The Innovator Solution, co-authored by Professor Christensen and Michael Rayner. Now imagine you went to a doctor, and as you walked in the doctor's office, immediately he saw you, he said, all right, here's this medication, I think you should take it and you'll be okay. And you're dazed, and you're like, well, you don't really know what's wrong with me. You haven't run any diagnostics, and you haven't diagnosed me properly. How can you prescribe this medication? And the physician says, well, last week I had a guy, similar guy, come in here, and I prescribed this medication to him, and he just left my office, and he's doing a lot better. So I think it'll work for you as well. I'm pretty sure many of us are not going to go back to see that doctor. Now, it sounds a bit funny, but those are the kinds of decisions we make when we think about innovation, when we think about development, when we think about creating prosperity in other parts of the world. We see decisions we've made in one region of the world that has worked, and we take that and implant that into another country with a very different context, very different culture, very different institutional framework and setup, and we expect it to work. And when it doesn't work, instead of stepping back and trying to diagnose the problem, we double down. And we say, you know what, let's get more money in there, let's get more resources, let's get more infrastructures. And so the importance of good theory, making decisions that are based on cause and effect, cannot be overstated. I'll give a quick story about how important this is. Yesterday in Professor Christensen's session, the morning session, he talked about data and how data lies, and there's a lot of data, and if you want data, you can, you know where to find it. Now, let me give you an illustration of how important that insight has been for me. Towards the end of 1998, towards the end of the 90s, there was a Sudanese entrepreneur who was at the time working in the UK. His name is Mo Ibrahim. Some of you might know of him. Mo Ibrahim was a techie. He was a PhD. He was working for a telecoms company. And he saw that in Africa at the time, there were roughly about 800 or so million people, but maybe a million or a couple million cell phone or telephone lines, most of which were in South Africa. And he went to his manager and said, look, I think we can actually build a viable business in this part of the world because nobody has cell phones. And his manager goes up to him and brings a lot of data and says, Mo, I thought you were smart. Look, there's a lot of corruption. There's a lot of poor people. There's no infrastructure at all. We can't trust the government. We can't trust the legal systems. And you're talking about investing billions of dollars of infrastructure, telecoms infrastructure, in countries where people don't even know how to really use a phone. And Mo said, look, I understand that, but think about Democratic Republic of Congo. The country has about 50-something million people, but there are about maybe 5,000 phones. I think we can create a new business model and serve the mass of people. Both presented with the same set of data, because the manager wasn't wrong, the data was right, but Mo came at it from a very different angle. He focused on the struggle that people were having in order to do their day-to-day jobs, to live their day-to-day lives. And after he worked at the company for another couple years, he decided to take on this opportunity. So he went about raising money, which was very difficult. He went about building the infrastructure and created a company called Celtel. Now, he started Celtel in 1998, and he realized that, look, his manager was actually right. It was very difficult. And he went to some countries where the government asked for money, and so corruption, and he had to either pull out or figure out how to integrate his operations so that he didn't have to pay bribes. And he went to countries where there were no roads, so they had to actually pull in the infrastructure and build the roads. Many countries didn't have up-to-par education systems, and so he had to engage in extensive training for his people. He pulled all that in as well. He went to countries where the business model of how we use cell phones in the West, where maybe you pay a monthly subscription and you get access to a lot of data, minutes, and so on, he had to change that business model around. But what he did in a span of 7 years, created employment for thousands of people in about 7 countries, and he sold the business for about $3.5 billion in 7 years. Now, if you take a step back and think about that for a second, this isn't a company like Snapchat or WhatsApp that's very light on infrastructure and very heavy on software and technology. And so the valuations are, pretty wild. And this is a company where you have infrastructure, you're dealing with labor, you're dealing with the legal system in countries where he hadn't worked before. But he was able to unlock $3.5 billion worth of value in the span of 7 years because he used good theory to assess the situation. His manager used the theory, if I invest money in these countries, I'm not going to see a return because of all these problems. Mr. Ibrahim instead said, if we invest money in these countries and pull in the necessary infrastructures, the necessary institutions, develop the culture we need to develop. Now, those are things that he would not have had to do if he were building a company in the US or in the UK or in Austria. But he understood that he was dealing with a very different kind of patient. And so he first had to diagnose the problem and create prescriptions or solutions that were contextual, that were specific to that circumstance. And so a very good theory helps you assess the data and say, if we do X in this circumstance, we expect that this is going to come out of it. And the goodness of a theory is really in the predictive power of it. And that's really what we are researching every day back in Boston. We're trying to apply theories that Professor Christensen and some of his colleagues have developed over the past 3 decades, and we're applying it to circumstances in emerging markets where many folks would write off investments and say,
Finish your sentence.
okay, I told you I was, but that's essentially what we're trying to do. I'll sit down now and we'll keep the conversation going. But thank you.
Excellent. What I will quickly do is direct a very brief question to each of our panelists and then open it up to all of you, and I'll try to keep it to questions that would have a broad interest. Tawfik, one of the things that really strikes me when I'm listening to your story is really you had to have that willingness to venture into the unknown. And I think that for many people who are intrigued but somewhat intimidated by going into emerging markets, that's an important quality. So I have a 2-part question for you is, one, what was the kind of internal dialogue you had to convince you to do that? And the second is that you had a very limited period of time. And I know in the West it's very popular to complain about pressure for quarterly results. But I think a year, if your boss really likes you, might be the period of time that some people may have to try and do something bold. So I just want your insight in, given that you know you have a finite period of time, how do you really go about making your case, trying to change minds, and assembling the right team who maybe can hand off after you're gone?
Yeah, thank you, Deepa, for that question. On the first one, what motivated me to say yes to this job offer in government? I would say that I saw that phone call as a call of duty to serve the country. I had left, as I said, my home country 35 years earlier, and I had government scholarship to study in Paris and at New York University. I thought the time has come to pay back my dues to the country. Also, I was motivated, if I can do a good job, to make an impact. As a business school professor, we think we make an impact, but rather on the hundreds of students or managers who come to our programs. This impact is at the scale of a country, and decisions can impact the life of millions of people. So I sought different scale, different type of positive impact, and fundamentally a unique opportunity and honor to serve my country. So that was my motivation. Now, if you say 1 year was too short, of course it was too short, because I had to learn very fast about the country, about the system, about the who's who in the political sphere and the gatekeepers, and hopefully learning fast without making mistakes and trying to reform. Why reform? In spite of that short mandate and not being elected or legitimate in the eyes of some, because I thought it's my responsibility as Minister of Higher Education not to change the system that is producing the tens of thousands of jobless people at the end of their studies. I thought if I do nothing, then by the end of my mandate, there will be maybe 80 to 100,000 new graduates that will be added to the stock of unemployed people. That's a responsibility. And I thought, as a technocrat, not politically affiliated, maybe I can do the seemingly impossible job. I can initiate a reform, even if I will not have the time to see the full rollout nationwide. But at least there will be a movement, and made it a very inclusive process, including the whole country's university presidents, the deans of the major higher education institutions, representatives of students, labor unions, university professors, labor unions, the economic ecosystem. And I told them, we are starting on this journey together. This is not Minister Jelassi's reform. This is your reform. I'll be stepping out in 1 year's time, but you are staying as university presidents, etc., etc. So I want that strong buy-in, so you take it to the next stage after I leave my post. And I'm glad that things did work out.
Nicolai, I have a question for you as well. I mean, you have studied, prior to even doing your work with Startup Europe, the work of many different artists, from different parts of Europe. You've written about art, and it seems to me that a lot of the arts community seems to see value in disparate ideas and influences, maybe a little bit ahead of the business community. Is there something that business can learn from the approach of artists of trying to converge different elements and working together collaboratively?
Well, what I've found is that I would say that what makes an interesting art scene is also quite similar to what makes an interesting startup scene. One example could be one of the big successes in Norway. It's the art scene in Bergen, where you started out with one institution who started to work internationally, and they started to attract artists from all around the world. And as they worked on, more and more institutions became well-known internationally. And I think what is interesting when you look at a diverse art scene, a dynamic and diverse art scene, is of course that often it succeeds if there are a variety of people who work in the ecosystem. That means that basically a good artwork is a story. You're telling a story about a certain situation, and if you are different, you will tell different stories. And I think that applies also for entrepreneurship, because I would say that very many interesting firms you're trying to solve a problem. And I think that if an ecosystem is diverse, there will be more problems that you will try to solve. And one of my major concerns for instance, in Europe with our ecosystems is that they are not opened up, they're open up to a certain segment of the population. And that means that we're sort of solving our problems. And I can't, it's hard for me to imagine what kind of problems do you have if you're a low-skilled worker or a person going on benefits. What kind of problems would you solve? But since we don't include them in the infrastructure, we will never get the solutions. The same thing we can say about the migrant that are coming to Europe. They come here, they experience things, they see problems that I never could imagine, but we're not able to get them in touch with the ecosystem.
And I'm going to ask a question to Efosa as well. I think you touched kind of on the issue of culture in your presentation. And I think that's something that weighs heavily on the mind of anyone coming from outside and trying to engage with emerging markets as well. And thus far, I've really seen big companies and small efforts using two very different frames with regards to that question. I think you see very big multinationals like McDonald's who entered India and decided to kind of respect the cultural beliefs of many people by not serving beef at all in any of their restaurants, which is a first for them. At the same time, you have very successful models like Grameen Bank, which actively challenged prevailing gender stereotypes in their business model by lending only to women. And they took a distinct point of view that, well, this may be the culture, but our job as entrepreneurs is to challenge that. And I'm wondering if you have thoughts on where it's appropriate to adapt and where it's appropriate to challenge.
Yeah, so I think the first thing I'd say is maybe we can step back a little bit and try to demystify that word culture. Right? Culture emerges over time. In fact, it's one of the theories that we study in the course. There's a great professor at MIT, Edgar Schein, who explains culture very simply. And essentially patterns of behaviors in a particular group of people that have kind of emerged over time as they have tried to solve local problems that are specific to them. And so when we go to a country or a region and they operate in a certain way, if it's different than how we operate, it might have the tendency to say there's something wrong with that culture or there's something off about it. But if you put yourself in that context and you try to operate differently, you'll find that you're not able to solve local problems. And so to your question about McDonald's and Grameen Bank, I think when we take a look at those two companies and how they approached whether to assimilate with the prevailing culture or to upend what they were seeing, one of the things I would posit is with McDonald's, if you have this prevailing culture of people not eating beef and it's so ingrained in their system and it means certain things to them as far as them seeing themselves make progress, and it's going to be very difficult to set up a business where you serve beef. Versus Grameen Bank, who comes in and says, we understand that women are disenfranchised, but those women still wake up every day and want to make progress in their lives. Those women have what we in our language call jobs to be done. They want to take care of their families. They want to make sure their kids go to school. They have circumstances that crop up where they want to make progress. And when that happens, and you're able to identify that and create an innovative solution that solves that problem, then people are going to be very willing to abandon existing cultural norms or behaviors for something that's going to help them make progress, help them improve their lives. And so I think it's a matter of really understanding what is that word culture, what does it mean, and how can I help individuals, organizations, or countries make progress in their lives.
Okay, well, I think we have started and you've had some really interesting insights from very different perspectives. And what I would like to do now is open it up for any questions. No Slido required. You can feel free to stand up and simply ask your question. And if you have a specific person that you want to direct it, please specify. If it's for everyone, let us know.
My name is Manfred Male from Ibrahim Medical. And I'd like to challenge Efosa a little bit. If I understand you correctly, you say that a good theory helps you predict the outcome. But I would like to think that there's so many more things that enter into the good outcome, like timing, and also the circumstances that are far beyond your control. Let me give you an example. Our company set out to build dialysis centers in India. In India, there's a massive demand and many people, millions of people die every year for not having access to infrastructure. So we set out to build dialysis centers in Andhra Pradesh for a fraction of the cost we have in Europe. At first, I was responsible for this business. I said, no way we can do it at that reimbursement rates. And the Indians said, okay, we try to do it, and we actually did it, and it worked. Yeah? And we say, hallelujah, we have a business model that works in India. Now we can replicate and put it out in every state. And we try to do the same, exactly the same business model, which has been proven in Andhra Pradesh to Bihar. Mm-hmm. And it terribly failed. Yeah? Because the circumstances still in the same country, but in another region were so much different. It's a failure until now. It works in Andhra Pradesh. So I think there's so much more.
Yes. So one of the and perhaps I didn't say this, but the circumstance is really the unit of analysis when developing a very good theory. And so it's not really the region or the country, it's really the circumstance. And so I don't know those two regions you spoke about, but my bet would be the lives and the cultures of people are quite different, and what they value are quite different in those two regions. The circumstances in their lives is really what you should use as the unit of analysis when you're creating a good theory, right? So you can say, in this particular circumstance, if you do this, it's going to work, and if you do something else, it's not going to work. So the circumstance is the unit of analysis. I would agree with what happened there, that you can't simply, because it works in one region of a country, replicate it in every single region of the country. You have to really look at the circumstance.
Okay, I think there's some other questions.
Hello, I'm Pranjul. I'm a challenge winner. And my question is primarily around good theory leading to great circumstances that can be predicted. Now, being a fellow researcher, the major issue that we face here is there are a lot of social and political variables that we can't really account for. And the example like Bihar and Andhra Pradesh. So when we're creating a theory like this, how do we mitigate for these risks that are unforeseen? Like it could be a political leader that's coming to power, it could be a natural calamity that's coming into play, it just could be a law that we never thought existed. So the success of the theory defined by the number of assumptions and variables that account for it. But how do we mitigate these unforeseen social and political variables? So that's my question to the panel.
Well, it wasn't directed to me. I'll take a crack at it. I don't think the point of theory is to try and predict every variable. I think the point of innovation is to create something that is desirable, that lifts people's circumstances, that answers their aspirations, because people find a way to do the things they really value, even in very difficult circumstances. If you look at even NGOs like Room to Read, where they've built libraries around the world, their condition is that any community that agrees to have a library must have people who are willing to commit to labor or something to put it together and maintain it thereafter. And they have built libraries in Nepal where women, before they start work, carry 50 kg of brick up and down mountaintops because that's how badly they want their children to go to school. So I think deeply understanding aspirations is a way to get around a lot of those issues. And I think the other thing is that there isn't a theory that's going to solve all problems. I think the whole point of entrepreneurship is to continuously experiment and learn and be in dialogue with consumers. And I think that's a mistake people really tend to make, especially among poor people. They are the people who are evolving the fastest, who are the hungriest, and the product lineup that's offered to them is the most boring, not necessarily helping them evolve. And that's why a lot of companies tend to see a great success in the first 6 months and then say, well, gee, things are going down, maybe we should exit the market. No, maybe you should do the same level of thought and upgrade that you do for all your other customers in these markets because the need is the greatest here.
Hans Streusser. Thank you for the story of Mo Ibrahim, and I liked it very much. And obviously, mobile phones laid the basis for many other innovations on the African continent, in African countries. And as you have been talking, Efosa, on culture, do you think that there's a specific African innovation culture, or thinking now mobile money and off-grid energy systems and so on? Or is it more a Kenyan or Nigerian innovation culture? Thank you.
I think, whether a culture is specific to a particular region, and so even within Nigeria, there are different cultures in different regions. Now, with regards to mobile money and Kenya, it's very successful there. I think it's very important for us to, again, we like to go back to what is the circumstance that people find themselves and what are they struggling with. And if you can really tap into that and find what we call, in our language, jobs to be done. In fact, if you Google that, you'll see some articles written by Clay, and one of his recent books called Competing Against Luck really talks about how do you find moments of struggle? How do you discover what a job to be done is that people are struggling with in different circumstances that allows you to innovate and create a product or a service that appeals to them. And so the question you asked essentially was looking for an answer, and I don't know that there's a Kenyan innovation or mobile money innovation or so on. I think it'll really be specific to the region, and once you do your analysis, you can then come up with really, really innovative products.
One of the things that strikes me based on your question is something that Efosa said, when they ran into trouble with education, they needed to have employees who had more skills than the community could provide through the schools that were there. And our instinct is to push education into them, and then hope that at the end of that journey there's a job that they can use education for. And I think what you described for education in that context is that it pulled education and pull it into your context so you actually need it, and then it works. And if you run into trouble with corruption, you can just create on how you deal with corruption, except if you pull it rather than push it, you internalize it in source, so that you don't have to go through anybody who has the opportunity to pull you up for money. Insert it. And so, to me, that's one of the most interesting insights, is rather than pushing, we pull it in. How did I do?
You did great. Yeah, no, let me just real quick piggyback on that. We heard Nicolai and Dr. Tawfik talk about how people graduate from schools and there are no jobs. But when you go to these countries, I bet you that one of the most lacking things is schools. And so when we think about the whole emerging market development scene, because we see, right, what we see is schools in the US and Austria and other developed countries, we say, okay, we know what the answer is. We take that and we push it in India, we push it in Nigeria, we push it in Kenya. And then you have what's happening where you have 80 to 100,000 students graduate from universities that have been pushed and they can't find jobs. But you go talk to executives at banks, at hospitals, at other businesses, and they say, we can't find skilled labor. So there's a mismatch because we have, again, this is where I anchored my conversation on a good theory. Because the good theory is if we push education, there'll be a job waiting for them. Instead of, we need to build organizations that have the capacity to pull education in. And so, big difference there.
I think
Good afternoon. My name is Alberto. I am from University of Milano, Italy. I have a question for Mr. Jelassi. Can you say more about the principle of your reform? I understand that in few minutes it's difficult to explain, but what are the main principles of your reform in order to have self-employment education? Thanks.
I mentioned that. Sure.
Maybe
Sure.
what worked and what didn't.
Sure. Okay. Yeah. So as I said, the whole education system that was set up since Tunisia got its independence from France back in 1956 stayed as it is, based on education for employment. Train the people. Once they graduate, either the government or the private sector will hire them. But as I said, government became overstaffed, cannot hire at all. Private sector too constrained, because it's mainly small, medium-sized enterprises. So over time, we ended up having tens of thousands of graduates from universities not being able even to get a first job. I said half of the country jobless people are university graduates. That's a time bomb that is ticking. It may lead to a new revolution. Yeah. So the question is, if you are a government, and most universities are state-run with free tuition fees, how would you solve this? You spend so much money on education, And all these people, 60% of the Tunisian population is under 25. How can you develop your country when more than half of the population cannot create wealth, cannot create economic development? It's a major issue for the country. So that's why I felt, although I was there for only 1 year, etc., I felt I have to start this process. And based on what I have learned, I started university in Tunis, continued in Paris, finished with a PhD in the US. I have seen 3 educational systems: my home country, Europe, USA. And I thought, let me try to get the best of each one and adapt that to the context. And let me involve everybody. So together we can come up with a solution. But from the start, my guiding principle, to be specific, was move from just education for employment to education for self-employment. You should be able, as a master's or PhD degree, to do something with the skills, with the competencies, with your know-how. You have a brain, you are educated. So why don't you start something small? And that's why we set up these incubators and hired tutors and coaches. So in the incubator, you have a free working space. You have access to technology. We have the state banks to give you the financing. What we wanted from you? Goodwill. Don't take it the easy way to sit in cafes all day long or at home. Come to the incubator. Come to the technology park. Come to the cyber park. And try to use your brain power. The competence will give you the confidence. And hopefully you try something and you learn from it, even if it fails. So that's why I said back to the question number 2 from the gentleman with the white shirt, the hardest thing was how to change the mindset of these young people. To say, yes, you studied engineering for 6 years, but we don't have a job for you. Now try to do something and be self-employed. Be your own employer, your own boss. I mean, mentally, people couldn't accept that initially, nor their families or friends. Because everybody said the dream was to become civil servant, guaranteed a job for life, maybe having a car or even a chauffeured car. So how can you change the mindset overnight? Because otherwise the reform will be just a paper reform. But as I said, the time was too short to be able to oversee the national rollout of it. We started with the pilot, but we didn't have the time. I did not have the time. And after that, politicians came back to the helm, and we were back to business as usual. What I mean by that? Politicians in a number of countries. First of all, personal interest. Second, political party interest. Thirdly, the country interest. In my case, I had no personal interest. I left a well-paid job in Paris. I left the family behind. I knew I was not going to become a politician. And I wasn't affiliated with any party, so I had no political party interest. I went there, as I told Deepa in answering her question, just trying to serve my country. So if the politicians can all rally around that, forget about your party lines and party interest, and forget about the next election, and do not commit to run as candidate for it. Work for the general interest of the public, and nothing else, and nothing else. I think we can make quite quantum leap forward.
Liz, I think you had a question.
Sort of answered it, but I was going to say, look at the time scale. 13 to 14, you were there. How did you define success? And then 14 to 16, are you still engaged at all, given the changes?
Yeah.
And has it worked despite the changes?
Yeah, good question. Actually, I left a year ago. I left in spring of 2015. Well, as I said, I meant to initiate a change. You know, it's hard enough to do it at small scale. How about if you do it at a country scale? People saw the value of it after I left. Because when I was in the post, of course, as usual, you have people sort of trying to criticize. They have their own opinion, a better way of doing it than yours. Now, the other part of your question is where are things today? I think the momentum has been a bit lost. The pace of implementation has slowed down. Why? Because I said the people who took over from us in that technocrat government have different views. They were all politicians. We are all, as I said, technocrats. Half of our government was made of Tunisian expatriates, like myself. So whether the composition of our team compared to the ones who succeeded us, major differences. And also, I think what I regret is a lack of continuity and lack of direction. That every government, or sometimes government think we are better than the previous one. We are smarter than them. We know what is best for the country. After all, they said, we are an elected government. We are more legitimate than these people who are just appointed. So what I'm saying is, in a number of countries, including mine, the regretful piece is there isn't continuity of direction policies, and sometimes the new team, if it doesn't undo what the previous team has done, they may go very slow on the reforms, on the major decisions undertook by their predecessors. This is what we are suffering from. Now, the last part of your question, am I involved? Not at all. Why? Because the new team did not reach out to me. They know where I am, they know how to reach me. Of course, I stepped back, I returned to academia. I am now professor at IMD Lausanne. But if they want an idea, an opinion, an involvement, of course, they can do that anytime. But I said, nobody. I was leading 3 ministries. Today, I'm replaced by 4 ministers. In these, none of them reached out to me to say, well, come and participate in a brainstorming session, or let me have a one-on-one meeting with you, or whatever. That's part of what I said, a lack of continuity of direction. Not necessarily in terms of policies and reforms, but even in terms of conversations and sharing experiences, etc.
Okay, I think we have time for probably 1 or 2 more questions, please. This is one of our Drucker Challenge winners in the most original essay category, so I will give you a chance and then we'll get to you as well.
Thank you very much. Okay, my name is Peter. I'm from Nigeria. My question is actually to Mr. Jelassi. First of all, I like what he said, that the more you study, the more likely you're going to remain jobless.
Unfortunately.
Yeah, unfortunately. Yeah, my question is, what is the minimum level of formal education that is recommended for someone that wants to be an entrepreneur? And the reason I'm asking this question is because Efosa made mention of the high level of unemployment in not Nigeria alone, sub-Saharan Africa, per se. In Nigeria, we have about almost 200 million people, and we have different regions. There is something that I think we've not, a lot of people have not studied, and is what is happening where I come from. They call it the apprentice model. We may want to call it that way. This is a parent decides for his child, look, I don't want you to study. Look at those that study, they end up being jobless, or they don't have much money in their bank account. I want you to go into apprentice. If the child may be, let's say, 7-year-old, you put him to someone who already have a successful business, and after like 10 years, when the child is 17, 20, that person that he served will now settle him. That's the word we just settle, as in he will give him a startup capital. So the child will end up having his own business, but with little or no formal education. Now he's working because, like in Nigeria, that part of the Nigeria that does this, we have big markets, largest market in West Africa, and they create jobs for people. They go to overseas, import goods. But I've also observed that they end up doing a one-man business. It doesn't expand to that big level. So I want to know, what is the minimum level of education that is recommended?
Yeah, thank you. That's a very important point. It's part of trying to change mindsets. Everybody wants to go to university. Young people don't want to go to vocational training centers. So in the country, in a way, we reversed the skill set pyramid. If you want somebody with a master's or a PhD, you have thousands of people available for you to choose from. But if you look for a driver, a carpenter, a gardener, whatever, good luck to find one available. These are vocational training center graduates. So people don't want to become a blue-collar worker. They want to become office workers, white-collar workers, etc. That's why there is a huge shortage in skilled people. And actually those people are even better paid than a doctor or than a lawyer or whomever. But it's again in the mindset and how society looks at some jobs. So this is part of my reform, to say, well, you'll do very well if you go to a vocational training center. There is immediate need for your skills. You'll get immediately a job, and it's even better paid than the jobs, if at all, for those who graduate with a master's degree from university. So that's the part of the message or the awareness creation. But again, it requires the whole society, the families, the friends, the ecosystem people to really also relay that message all the time to convince these young people university is not the answer to everything. And a master's degree is not your way for a better future.
I think we have 2 questions in the back. We'll try to get to both of them the best we can.
One additional question to this mind business. It is said that Facebook had supported the Arabian Spring for a transformation of a country. Do you think that some virtual platform, perhaps beyond Facebook and the potential of Facebook, would have helped the transformation, would have helped to make this mind shift at scale, would have helped to have a different level of collaboration within the economy?
Let's take the other question as well. I think that's getting a little bit more into the political issues that are particular to this rather than the
No political, from an economic point of view, from a learning point of view, from a transformational point. I'm not looking for the politics, but for the economic transformation.
Let's also log what the other question is so that we can make sure we try to get to as much as we can.
Matthias Reuter, I'm working for Siemens Global Learning. And I would like to come back to that point, Efosa, you made, and Clay, of the pull and push of education. How do you see also the responsibility of corporations? So we are doing business to society. And with big infrastructure projects, it's in the meanwhile, if we have the capture teams going after these huge projects, education and learning is a key issue. So, and there's a win-win. So the education is desperately needed for the new technologies. And we are well known for education. So we are building schools. For example, just recently in Egypt, in a quite short of time, with local support, of course, with the local people, we built up a school for 900 apprentices. And I think that's a very clever model. So how do you see also the responsibility of the corporations? And even for them, it is a differentiator because they need the talent, they need the people.
Yeah, so why don't you take a brief crack at that question first, and then...
and that's less related to university, but really to vocational training. Right. It's really on the shop floor.
Yeah, no, I think that's excellent. What you guys are doing is going to give you a competitive advantage. Now, with our research, what we try to do is, because right now we have a base of the pyramid, but at one point it wasn't a pyramid, it was a box, a square. Everybody was poor in the world. So with our research, what we try to do is go back and say, how did the countries that are rich now get to where they are, to get to be prosperous? And one of the things we find is corporations at the time pulled in a lot of the infrastructures that the government in these rich countries today now manage. The railroads in the US, it was started by some private investors in Baltimore and Ohio. It was Baltimore, Ohio company. If you look at the Asian Tigers, POSCO, it's a big steel company. They built a school that pulled in education because they knew they needed a lot of technical managers. Now it's a university. Formosa Plastics in Taiwan. Henry Ford, when he was building his plants, he pulled in infrastructures and education. Now we see the results of a lot of these investments that were pulled, and we then say we're taking those answers and we're going to push. But I think your strategy of pulling in the education that you need, it'll take a little bit longer time, it could, to get your returns, but it's a strategy for success because, again, if you go back long enough to rich countries today, it's exactly what the corporations at the time who wanted to serve the average people in society, that's exactly what they did.
Okay, I'm going to give you a very brief minute, Tawfik, and then I will wrap up the session with a closing comment. So you said you wanted...
No, my closing comment, and first of all, I'm very honored having Professor Christensen attending this session. And I want to say to him also that When I arrived in government, I thought, how can I use innovation and breakthrough disruptive innovation in government? And I'm sure to all of you, you may say this is a contradiction in terms. Government and innovation, how can they work together? Governments are here to enforce procedures, not to explore, experiment, etc. But we did it. We set up what we call the government lab in a different building by young technology-savvy people. We gave them the resources and we protected them from the line organization and the traditional ministries. And the big projects, we gave them to the government lab. The building looked different, not offices, admitting open workspace on every floor. Cross-ministerial team, cross-silos, cross-departmental team on every floor. And we tell them, we need to reform the national subsidy system. Go ahead and do it. Because when we talk to the traditional ministries, they said, we need 3 to 4 years to reform the nation's subsidy system. That team did it in less than 1 year. So what is that? Breakthrough innovation, not incremental improvement. Inspire, motivate, experiment, trial and error, result-based accountability, not action-based accountability. We try to try and to implement disruptive innovation in a government structure. And that helped us a lot. That was an enabler for us to achieve some quick wins within the short time of our mandate.
I'd like to just quickly close the session with just a few of my own observations. I think you've heard a really interesting diversity of opinion here. And I think the important thing to remember is that as we get very interested in technologies, and all of those things are part of the transformation, but what you still tend to see across countries is that what really pays off is an investment in people, whether it is rich, poor, that is the long term. And especially as we move toward an ideas economy, I think that's even more the case. And if you look at the statistics, I think we all believe that good ideas come from everywhere, but great brands and great companies do not. Not so far. And all of the developed countries have one characteristic. They've been able to create big businesses, multinationals. They've been able to go beyond their borders. And I think that's almost like a really distinct form of development. And innovation really is the development policy that actually seems to work. If you look at all of the innovation indices, there are many different ones, you could get through about 70 countries before you even see one middle income country show up. So the correlation between innovation and per capita income is pretty irrefutable. And it also correlates with many things like respect for individual freedom, because if money is driven by ideas, we must respect each other in order for those ideas to be heard. And I think Peter Drucker had such a timeless way of summarizing everything when he said, innovation is what creates a resource. Nothing is a resource until man finds a use and endows it with economic value. Until then, every plant is a weed and every mineral is just another rock. So I think it's really the onus is on us. The potential has always been there, but it's all up to all of us to figure out how to realize that potential. Thank you.